Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Martha's Vineyard Commission Housing Action Task Force presentation of the 2024 Zoning Analysis for Housing Solutions put together by Barrett Planning. Also, the accompanying model bylaw toolkit, which we hope you will find super helpful and informative. So this is going to be a 90-minute presentation tonight. We're hoping to land the plane right at 7:30. So we're going to start with the excellent and fantastic Judy Barrett, who heads Barrett Planning, doing a presentation with a PowerPoint on the zoning analysis. On the invitation that everyone received was a link to the actual analysis itself. Lucy, would you be able to drop that in the chat for folks who didn't access it? If you want to see the actual analysis or do a split screen so you can see the actual report itself or download it for your own use, that is on the Martha's Vineyard Commission website on the housing page. It's the top two entries on the housing page. So you'll see the 2024 zoning analysis for housing solutions and then the model bylaw toolkit immediately underneath that. This is a project that the MVC did with Barrett Planning for the use of the island towns. It's an update and improvement on the 2014 all island zoning analysis, which targeted solutions for affordable housing. And we're just really thrilled with how this came out. I think Barrett Planning's put together a really excellent, useful toolkit for the island towns. And I'm sure you're all aware that we did release the short-term rental model bylaw and the ADU model bylaw in October to the town councils and to the affordable housing committees and planning boards. So the towns have already been using those. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Judy. I think the way we're going to format this is Judy's going to go all the way through her presentation. Please hold your questions till the end or drop them in the chat if you think you're not going to remember them. And then we'll go to the Q&A at the end. Does that work for you, Judy?
Yeah, I think that's great.
Okay, super, great. And with that, I will pass it off to Judy.
Okay, super. So I see some faces I recognize and some I don't. It's nice to see everybody. I think I'm just going to go ahead and bring my slides up. I won't be talking for 90 minutes. I want to just assure all of you, you don't have to listen to me that long. But I do have a lot to say. And I think with the 90 minutes, we'll probably have, ample time for some questions and discussion as well. So I'm glad you were all able to make it. So
And
I'm
just
going
before, Judy, just before you start, I do want to mention to everyone, just remind everybody, this meeting is being recorded and we're going to post the recording of this meeting on the Martha's Vineyard Commission YouTube page on the Housing Advocacy playlist. So I will share that link around with all the boards and committees in town. Please feel free to share that with your own board and committee members and community members. It's public access and we'd like to make this as accessible to as many people as possible.
Sounds great. All right, I'm going to open up my slides. And just get this up here. Okay. So this project was really a labor of love for us. I just want to let you all know that. It's kind of a daunting task to take the zoning bylaws for 6 towns and try to digest them and really do sort of what I would call a deep dive into what they say and what they don't say, what they imply, what they, the kinds of unintended consequences they may involve, and then kind of come back to what your charge is, which is to focus on impediments to housing. But sometimes we do a lot of this kind of work, and one of the things we've all learned is that if you just sort of do a keyword search through a zoning bylaw for words like housing, you're going to miss a lot. And so you really have to read through the entire zoning bylaw to understand how it works or what it thinks it works like. So you can begin to understand maybe some underlying constraints that aren't all that obvious. So what I'm trying to do in this presentation is really just do a high-level key findings. If you've had a chance to read the report, nothing I'm going to say will surprise you. If you haven't had time to read it, that's fine. Some of what I say may surprise you, but may not. So I'll do kind of a high level key findings. And then I'm going to go through some of the topics that we looked at that the commission had specifically asked us to review for, and some of the things that we found in that review. And then I want to talk about the analysis by town section of the report, because one of the things that the commission asked us to do was not only to do this sort of topic level review of all 6 bylaws, but then zoom in on each town one at a time with some recommendations. And my slides really just cover the sort of highlight recommendations. There are many more in each town's section of the report. So you're going to want to focus in on that and think about what ideas in the report might be useful to you, which ones you think you can or want to implement. And we're always happy to hear where people disagree with us too. So we'll talk about the analysis by town, and then I want to just open it up for discussion. So the key findings. You have a number of regulatory constraints on your housing supply in the Vineyard, and this is true for all 6 towns. The constraints kind of vary somewhat. Some communities are maybe not quite as intense, some of them are more so. But I think as an overall comment, the zoning in your communities tends to encourage larger lot, single-family development. Single-family development is the preferred form of residential development in all of your communities. Your zoning makes that very clear. It makes it clear through a number of ways, from what's permitted to what's not permitted. There is a tendency in most of the zoning bylaws, and I say most because there are a few exceptions here and there. Most of the zoning bylaws really either outright discourage or simply forbid a variety of housing options. So if you're trying to do an analysis of zoning bylaws for impediments to housing, you're going to look at not only, well, what do you allow, but what's difficult to do, because both send a message. In discouraging a variety of homes and a variety of densities and scale, there is also a tendency to discourage efficient use of land. I think one of the things we've learned in the planning world is that although sometimes large lot, so-called rural or semi-rural zoning gives people the sense that that there's a lot of open space and that the zoning is very protective of wildlife, that's actually often not true. That large lot zoning tends to fragment open space, is not really as protective for wildlife as we would like. And that perhaps the most important thing we can all do as communities that care about the quality of our natural and built environment is to think about ways that we can efficiently use land to meet our needs for humans, and then be able to save what should be saved for for wildlife and other interests, water supply and so forth. So it's just a general comment that there's not, in most cases, a real attention to how do you use land efficiently and conservatively so that you can save what needs to be saved and then build what should be built. And then there's really no provision in most cases for what I would call worker housing. And that has different meanings to people. So, you have some communities where there is a reference to employee housing. It tends to be somewhat smaller scale. I understand that, it's the Vineyard. But when you don't have any provision at all, it sort of forces either the demand for employee housing to just end up encroaching on the housing supply that one would prefer to have available for year-round resident use. Or it is not necessarily an efficient way to house employees, such as single-family homes, where something like a small dormitory might be a better option, be able to house more workers and help your businesses to be able to thrive. On other regulatory constraints, there's not a lot of incentive for mixed-use development. Some of your towns have it. Some of it is not as easy to work with as perhaps one would like, but it's not common, I guess I would say. There's not a straightforward way to use small lots for affordable housing. I suspect you all know under the Affordable Homes Act, some of that is being loosened up. Part of what you're going to hear from me as I go on in this is that a number of things that are in the Affordable Homes Act already were available to communities. And so there's some interesting things to talk about on the Vineyard. One of which is thinking about how do you make use of substandard lots for affordable homes. Most of the towns on your island don't have great ways to address demolition. So if you're really interested in trying to preserve housing that is affordable, sort of what we call naturally occurring affordable housing, it's hard to do that because you just don't have demolition tools available in your current regulatory scheme. Another thing that was kind of striking to us, given the concerns on the island around homelessness and appropriate solutions for populations experiencing homelessness, is that we didn't really find anything in the zoning that addresses needs for emergency shelter or transitional housing or any kind of special needs housing. And one can make a case that those things are, for the most part, already protected under state law. But if you actually want to provide for something and make it clear to the organizations that provide that kind of housing, it's good to have it in your zoning. And then make clear how, through, say, site plan review, those types of uses will be reviewed and approved. I know that some of this is changing, but bear in mind this report was done in October, and we're now in January. So some of what I'm going to say is a little bit dated, because I know that some of you were already working on short-term rentals or ADUs, but at the time that we were reviewing the zoning, most of the bylaws either limited or prohibited accessory dwelling units. And as I expect you all know, as of February, regardless of what your zoning says, accessory dwelling units that are consistent with changes to the State Zoning Act will simply be permitted as of right. So it's a good idea for people to be talking now about how they're going to address that need. One of the topics that I think was just striking to us in reviewing your zoning is the reliance that I think most towns have on the use of special permits. So I don't know who's on this meeting. I don't know how much of you are zoning geeks. So I'll just say, under Massachusetts law, there's a few ways to permit development. One is simply what we call as of right, which can be as simple as going to the building department to get a building permit. It may be a subdivision handled by the planning board. It may be a permitted use that is subject to site plan review. Or it can be a use where the town is saying, we're not so sure we want to allow this just anywhere. Or that we want to allow it just because someone wants to do it. So we're going to pull the reins back a little bit and impose a special permit requirement on particular uses. And what that does is it gives the planning board or the Board of Appeals, who are usually the special permit authorities, the ability to look on a case-by-case basis at something a property owner or developer wants to do with a piece of property. So the upside often from the perspective of local officials is, well, we get control. The downside to the property owner or the developer is, I'm heading into a risky territory here because they can say no. Do I want to put myself and my money into something where at the discretion of a board, I might be turned down, and meanwhile I've spent money trying to do something with my property. So special permits are kind of a double-edged sword. I think in the planning world today, we encourage communities to think about perhaps not relying so much on special permits as a discretionary way to say no, but rather to think about how you can write zoning so that uses that are permitted may have to meet certain standards to be permitted, but if they meet those standards, they're permitted. And therefore, you don't need the discretionary review process. The fact is that most of your towns rely heavily on special permits. In some cases, the requirements to get a special permit seem quite burdensome. There is, of course, with any special permit, a high degree of discretion. Another problem or issue from a property owner's point of view with the special permit is that it requires by law a public hearing. Unlike a permitted use, a special permit use requires a public hearing. So the process itself, just to get to yes, opens the door for abutters and others to stop something that they don't like, which from a special permit granting authority may be an important thing to know. But if you're trying to encourage housing, which is often controversial, then you got to balance how important is it to have the control to say no versus getting the housing we need. I think that's a balancing test that every board and commission in Massachusetts, not just on the Vineyard, needs to be thinking about. How do I balance that local control with getting the housing we need? And then I would just say, as a sort of closing comment about special permits, that because they involve risk to the applicant, because it's kind of an unknown, it will tend to discourage new development when the easier option is going with what's allowed by right. And therefore, it tends to limit housing choices. Another thing that was interesting about reading your zoning bylaws is that, we're certainly aware that under home rule in Massachusetts, communities have great latitude in how they write their zoning. And we have a lot of respect for that. I think, though, when you enter an environment like yours, where you have 6 towns occupying, cohabiting this island together, that for someone to come to the island to perhaps help your communities address housing needs, it would be great if some greater consistency existed in your zoning. And that's not to say everybody has to have the same districts, have to have the same standards, but just thinking about the way you use language, how you define terms, how you organize the content of your zoning bylaws, so someone who maybe is coming in from outside the community can read it and understand it. I think as a rule, most of the bylaws that we read would really benefit from some, I would call, comprehensive update. Sometimes we call it just a recodification. In other words, just a reorganization, updating for language, updating for consistency with state law and judicial decisions. I think all of you could use some focus on that. And, fortunately, the commission has completed its housing needs assessment, which does create a nice framework for thinking about tiers of affordability, which we talk about in the zoning analysis. And just as a starting point, it would be great if all 6 towns could kind of embrace those definitions so that we're all talking about the same thing. When we talk about households that are lower income versus needing, affordable housing or workforce housing or community housing, these terms all end up easily becoming distorted and being used in different ways. So you have the advantage right now as towns on the island to have a, fresh off the press needs assessment that does provide a nice framework, and it would be good to think about it. I will also say that in Massachusetts, more than in other states where I've worked, the definition of affordable housing often just defaults to this idea of housing that's affordable to people whose incomes are at or below 80% of the area median income. And we don't need to put those numbers up. I just want to say that tends to be a standard definition. It's more so in Massachusetts than other places. And a lot of that is because of Chapter 40B. So communities are often anxious to have their affordable units count, if you will, toward the 10%, when that may be addressing a need, but there may be other needs too. So thinking about how you address the full spectrum of need through zoning would be wise. So I think as an overall comment, your communities as a group have just too many markets competing for the same inadequate supply. I think some folks would like to find a solution maybe that would just sort of fix all this and not necessarily have to grow any more housing. And I'm here to tell you that's not going to happen. For you to actually begin to address the needs that exist, because there's a variety of needs, you need to think about pairing housing growth, new supply, with housing preservation, with year-round housing restrictions, and then also including in this mix ways to accommodate group living arrangements. I think all of those things are going to need to come together to begin to have a sound housing policy for Martha's Vineyard. And I would also point out that, needs do exist kind of at all market levels, from sort of normal people who just kind of want to work every day to folks who are very lower income to folks who have, professional jobs with somewhat higher incomes. Everybody's competing for a supply that doesn't work. So at some point, that supply has got to grow. And often people don't want to hear about housing growth, but I have to say it because that's my job. But I'm not going to leave it at that. You also need preservation. You need year-round housing restrictions. You need that. You need all of this because you are kind of a unique environment. So let me just give a little bit of a look at the regulatory analysis section of the report. Laura had asked us to look at a series of issues. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I've combined a few along the way here. But just so people understand kind of the range of things that we looked at, opening up 6 zoning bylaws and trying to figure out how they worked and what they said or what they didn't say. So multifamily dwellings, from a housing policy perspective, this is one of the most important reforms that I think every community needs to be thinking about. How do we do this? So what we found in looking through your zoning is that except for 2 small locations, I believe, if my memory is correct, in Tisbury and West Tisbury, they're only allowed by special permit, where they are allowed at all. Conversion from a single family to a multifamily or even just a 2-family home is even more limited. We mapped a lot of this and just tried to understand, well, where can you do things? And it was difficult enough to find places where multifamily housing was allowed, period. But then through conversion, it seems that was even more limited. And I will say more about this a little bit later because 2-family homes and multifamily homes are not the same. But what they all speak to is increasing supply. And how do you do that in an arena or geography where a lot of your housing is smaller scale? And I'm here to tell you that it can be done, but you can't do it at all if you don't allow it. The ease of developing single-family homes on larger lots meets a very legitimate housing interest. We're certainly not going to tell you that that's a bad thing to do, but it comes with social and environmental costs that I think people need to be thinking about. Multifamily housing, in my experience, is absolutely critical for the effectiveness of inclusionary zoning. Inclusionary zoning works best with multifamily housing. This isn't just from my experience. This is, I think, widely known in the planning world. If you want inclusionary zoning to work to actually produce affordable units, you need multifamily housing to do that.
Judy, just for folks who aren't familiar with that term, can you define inclusionary zoning?
Sure.
Please?
Inclusion. Yes, thank you. So inclusionary zoning is the concept of requiring developments to provide affordable housing. And it typically applies at some trigger point. So a development of 10 or more units may have to provide an affordable unit. And there are different ways the developer can comply, from creating the unit within the development to paying a fee in lieu of creating a unit. And that fee revenue goes to an affordable housing trust. Some communities allow a developer also to provide what's called an offsite unit, where perhaps the affordable unit they have to create doesn't go in their development, but might go somewhere else in the community. And there are trade-offs in all of these, but the point is it's a regulatory mechanism to ensure that as housing development ensues, that there is an affordable housing benefit along with a market rate benefit. So if you just think about what that means, it's a heck of a lot easier for an applicant to accommodate some affordable units in a multifamily development than it is in a single family development on a somewhat larger lot, because you have higher land costs, you have higher construction costs. It's all of that. If you really want the affordable housing, you need to be thinking about allowing multifamily. We think it's a critical choice for your housing supply. It's just a way to get more housing available without chewing up a lot of land, but also for the economics of providing affordability. It creates choice. Um, you can allow multifamily housing as of right and regulate it through site plan review. Um, again, we didn't find that except for 2 small locations. Special permits for multifamily dwellings in an area where it's otherwise single family by right. What am I going to do as a developer? Am I going to take the risk or not? Well, it really, I guess, would depend in part on whether you thought the board that you have to work with is actually amenable to multifamily housing or not. But I will certainly say if it's allowed as of right, subject to clear standards in your zoning, as a developer, I would do it. I'm not sure I'll make the same calculus if I think I have to go through a lot of hurdles. And I would just say from a policy perspective, I'm not really sure what those hurdles get a community, except the ability to say no. Because anything you can require through like qualitative conditions in a special permit, you can deal with as standards for the use that are then regulated through site plan review. The other thing I'll say about multifamily housing is that it is a tool for minimizing sprawl. So if you're trying to think about efficient use of land, including multifamily housing in your toolbox of residential development options is just smart planning. And it can be especially good for infill sites, especially in or around a town center area where you've already got it's more built up anyway. Sometimes an infill site is great for a very small multifamily dwelling. So it's just a good thing to have, and most of you don't have it in a way that would be very effective from a development point of view. We also looked for this concept of congregate housing. So knowing that employee housing is a concern, it tends to fall into this bigger bucket of congregate housing. So we kind of looked at congregate housing from a couple of different perspectives. And the model bylaws are different based on who the intended population is of that congregate housing. Most of your towns, as of October, when we finished this report, did not have specific provisions for employee housing, whether it's seasonal or year round. A few of you do. It is common in resort towns elsewhere in the United States. That picture that's here is not Martha's Vineyard. That's actually Colorado. We find employee assisted housing or employer owned housing really all throughout the Midwest and the West. It's just in resort towns. This is the way things get done. And it would be really important for all of you to think about how to accommodate employee housing. There are these intertwined issues, however, is that, for example, I know this has come up in one of the towns recently on the Vineyard so we're allowing sort of dormitory style or congregate housing. How do we deal with overcrowding? How do we regulate this activity and protect nearby neighborhoods? There's also the issue of how you define family. Several of your towns define family in a way that raises significant fair housing concerns. By fair housing, I mean the Federal Fair Housing Act. For those of you who don't know, people often think of the Federal Fair Housing Act as protecting people of color, which it does. Protecting people based on their religion, based on sex, based on disability. Well, families with familial status, i.e. families with children, are also protected under the Federal Fair Housing Act. And families can be, groups of people who are unrelated. So if you have zoning that restrictively defines a family as people who are married by, people who are married or related in some way by blood or adoption, you are foreclosing the opportunity for other types of families to occupy housing in your community. So these are intertwined issues. It came up in this review mainly because we're thinking about barriers to some type of dormitory or congregate housing for employees, but it really goes beyond that. It gets to the heart of how do you accommodate a variety of different types of households in your community? And when not everybody wants a single family home, and may, need the affordability of sharing space, sharing a dwelling so that they can share, kitchens and living rooms and so forth. When you don't allow congregate housing and then you define family in a restrictive way, you make that kind of housing choice unavailable. So the only other thing I'll say about employee housing, which is just tricky, is thinking about from an employer perspective or an employee perspective for that matter, how do you deal with issues around parity for other employees? I know this is coming up right now in one of your communities that where there's an opportunity to create some housing for a particular class of employees, but then you've got other employees who don't have access to employer assisted housing. Well, that's not a problem for zoning, but it's something that comes up in this discussion about employee housing. So don't be surprised if you hear that kind of concern. I worked on a project in Nantucket a couple of years ago where for an employer, a large employer, where it was very much a concern, like, well, who gets the housing and who doesn't? Well, you don't have to worry about that from a zoning perspective, but just know that those kinds of questions come up. The main thing for a community, especially in a resort area, is to make sure that you provide housing types that work for the people who are going to work for your businesses and that allow your businesses to thrive. So some of it's year round and some of it's seasonal. And then taking the pressure off the single family homes, the smaller, 2-family or townhomes, take the pressure off that housing stock to house seasonal employees would be really smart.
Hey, I'm just going to interrupt for just a minute. So
Sure.
people are posting questions to me and Lucy separately. It's really hard for us to keep track of that. If you go to the names on the right side and click on that drop-down menu, your top hit is going to be meeting group chat. We're going to ask that you post your questions to meeting group chat so we can all see it and keep track of them. Otherwise, your individual questions may get lost in the shuffle, and we want to make sure that we can answer everybody's questions. Is everyone able to access meeting group chat? And if for some reason you're on your phone and you're unable to do that, then if you could direct the question to me, I will cut and paste it into the meeting group chat. Thank you. Go ahead, Judy.
No problem. So smaller, undersized lots, we were also looking at this long before the Affordable Homes Act. Communities could provide for non-conforming lots to be used for affordable housing. It's been done in Massachusetts before. It's still available to you. The Affordable Homes Act opened up an opportunity, but I just want to point out that this is an example of something where you don't necessarily need special statutory authority to do it. So you can allow a lot that's otherwise unbuildable for, say, a single family home to be used for a deed restricted affordable unit. Most of you have something for this. Most of them seem to require some type of special permit, and some of those special permit criteria struck us as perhaps important for you guys to revisit, because there are some civil rights concerns among others. And one is limiting eligibility on who can purchase a lot, say someone who's an existing resident or people with established connections to the town. It's something you're going to want to think about, whether you're creating a situation where a limited pool of people actually can take advantage, can benefit from the availability of affordable housing, and whether that subjects you to, I guess, for the lack of a better phrase, a liability going forward, which probably nobody needs. We noticed in one or more of the bylaws that there was some special permit criteria around evaluating the impact of, say, using a smaller lot for housing versus the impact on the neighborhood as a whole. And we kind of thought, well, that's sort of interesting. If you're only allowing a single family home on a small lot, but it's in a single family district, how do you justify kind of thinking about whether there's some impact on the neighborhood when you're not already reviewing any other single family home through the same lens? So those kinds of concerns really raise potential civil rights issues that I think you folks want to think about. Under the Affordable Homes Act, as you probably all know, There's the opportunity to use smaller lots for residences that will not be short-term rentals. Also ability under the Affordable Homes Act to do tiny homes. So you have some new opportunities available to you as seasonal communities, which is great. But I just want to say, developing a lot for an affordable unit does not have to require a special permit. What you have to be able to say is that there is this higher public benefit that's achieved by allowing this lot to be used when it otherwise could not be used at all. And what it does is it makes very clear in your zoning, we want this, we want affordable housing. We have this land that could be used for it. Undeniably, folks, any use like that still has to satisfy Title V, still has to satisfy the local wetlands bylaw if you have one. So, but this is just about zoning. This is about land use. If you actually want to be able to allow more types of housing, you have the ability to allow smaller lots to be used for it. You just need to be able to say, you can't put a gigantic market rate house on this small lot, but you could do an affordable unit. And here are the public benefits for doing so. Mixed use zoning. Sometimes people think mixed use zoning is all like big buildings that are out of scale. I put that picture on here. This is not from Martha's Vineyard, it's from New Hampshire. The apartment that's upstairs, I grew up in for the first 4 years of my life. And I'm here to tell you that mixed use zoning does not ruin town centers and doesn't ruin neighborhoods. You can think about mixed use zoning as sort of a combination of 3 different types. There's sort of the top of the shop, which is the standard people think of. That's the store that my dad owned. You can think about so-called horizontal mixed use, which is a collection of buildings where some are specifically residential and maybe one is commercial, but they're all under one ownership on the same lot. Or live-work units are another way to think about so-called mixed use zoning. Within those varieties, you create choice, and you also create a climate where you could be helping your business community as well. So again, this is something that can be done through site plan review. It's a good idea if you're going to allow mixed use development as of right, that you have clear standards in your zoning for doing so. We notice that mixed use in some form or another is specifically in the zoning in 3 of your communities. The permitting procedures are very different. The requirements are different. This is an example of something where just stepping back and reading through the zoning, I'm not sure how those differences really serve your towns well. It's a local question. It's not one I can answer. But I do think it's an example of where perhaps somehow trying to be a little more uniform in how you think about mixed use development could probably be very helpful to all of you, and begin to sort of cultivate a recognition that we are 6 towns, but we are one island. You know, thinking about context too, you know, you can go a little bit crazy with design standards sometimes on mixed use zoning. But I think if you approach it in a practical way, in a way that doesn't end up with dimensional standards that don't really work for what you say you want for design, if you can unify those concepts, you actually can have you know, really nice success with some mixed use development in your communities, and address not only a housing need, but also an economic development interest as well. Manufactured housing. People often bristle when we bring this up, but it's just really important to say this. Almost all your zoning, I think with the exception of maybe one town, people don't allow mobile homes. You're not unique. It's kind of everywhere. Nobody allows mobile homes. They're actually called manufactured housing, but the language of zoning has not kept up. So the thing you got to know about manufactured housing is it's probably the most affordable housing option available. And yet communities don't allow it. Sometimes in planning, we sort of scratch our heads and say, so tiny homes are okay, detached accessory dwelling units are okay, but mobile homes are not okay. And what's kind of going on here? For some people, a manufactured home is the only way they're ever going to become a homeowner. It is a way to provide for an accessory dwelling unit in a way that's fairly affordable for the existing homeowner. Most of you just don't address this at all, except to prohibit them. So I think if there's going to be kind of an honest conversation about a variety of ways to create affordability, manufactured housing should be part of that conversation. In other states outside Massachusetts, the constraints on manufactured housing are being lifted at state legislative levels because it is such an affordable way to house people. There are a few churches out in the Midwest area that are using manufactured housing for shelter. I mean, people are making use of this type of structure, but in Massachusetts, we seem to still be very much of the mindset that that just is inherently in conflict with a single family district. It's not good housing, or whatever ideas people have. But I'm here to tell you, it is often the only way that some people ever become owners of housing. Demolition delay. So in most places, demolition delay is a tool for historic preservation. That is just the way it has evolved. It's not the only way, and I'm going to talk about Nantucket. It's not even the main way there. But there's a variety of good examples of demolition delay that you can be thinking about. If your policy concerns are historic preservation or thinking about being more of a climate-friendly community, to reduce the amount of construction waste that's getting generated by development in your communities, demolition delay is the way to go. It's a very important tool to have. And we only found it in a couple of places on the vineyard, and I was a little bit surprised by that. If for no other reason than history and character seem to matter so much to your towns. But stepping back from just a strictly historic preservation view, is this sort of idea that, do you really want to lose a dwelling that may be perfectly fine, but doesn't meet the needs of a buyer who wants a much larger home? So in Nantucket, just a good example, there is a provision that's recently been amended to make it easier for people to try to move a house. But there's a provision that essentially says that if you want to move a house, if you want to demolish a house, you have to go through a process first to make it known that that building is available to be relocated somewhere else, so it can be protected. Or if someone else wants to buy the property, to protect the unit, there's a notice requirement. It used to be fairly limited. It's now very public. It's a longer period, so someone can say, yeah, I'd like to be able to maybe move that house onto my lot. Bear in mind, in Nantucket, people are also allowed to have pretty freely a second dwelling on their property, and that's been true for a very long time. So one of the things that's made the Nantucket bylaw work is the ability under their zoning for someone to have 2 dwelling units on a single lot. So it goes together. In any case, they've had a lot of success in Nantucket trying to save older housing that might not be as fashionable as one would like today if they were building new, but to provide some semblance of affordability and, frankly, keep to a minimum the amount of construction debris that's being created on that island. So their bylaw is worth looking at. It's kind of a cool model. The Massachusetts Historical Commission also has both model bylaws and excellent technical assistance. You can simply look at some of their examples and not be quite so hung up on whether it's for historic preservation purposes only, but rather to see how demolition delay actually works from a mechanical point of view. Their library is just an excellent resource.
And I will just interject there to say that the back wing of my house is the result of the demolition delay in Edgartown 18 years ago. It was a home that was going to be torn down. And because of that demolition delay clause, I was able to move 800 square feet on tractor trailers over here and attach it to the back of my house. So it is really effective if it's written properly.
That's really cool. That's really a wonderful example. So the short-term rental situation, I'm sure all of you can kind of appreciate, it gets complicated. I think we all can see the impact that short-term rentals have on access to potentially year-round housing or reducing the year-round supply. The impact of having essentially commercial activity going on in neighborhoods. I mean, all that's kind of understood. And then there's the perspective of, well, what if I'm a homeowner and I need to make some of my property available for short-term rental purposes so I can afford to keep my house? These conversations get really tough. So thinking about how much STR activity to allow on a given piece of property in any over a 12-month period, the kinds of limitations that you can place on that activity while still allowing some short-term rental use, I think it's just a real challenge. In any case, we all kind of know that you really need to be thinking about addressing short-term rentals, both through a general bylaw to address registration as well as zoning. I mean, that is pretty much the state of the art right now. But certainly you got to think about in zoning, how are you defining this use? And you're probably all familiar with the case that happened in Nantucket, but just to be clear, that really does need to be addressed. I think that in communities I've worked in, not just your towns, but communities that have a very limited repertoire of hotels or motels or sort of traditional, accommodations for tourists, there tends to be this greater pressure on the single family home inventory to meet a need for hospitality and tourism. It actually happened in my own town, where there's no hotels allowed here. And someone was allowing her property to be used on weekends as a short-term rental. The neighbors complained. The Board of Appeals really had no choice but to stop it. And she lost her home, and her 2 kids didn't get to finish high school here. So, I mean, there are these human stories that go with short-term rentals that are kind of heartbreaking. But in any case, I think in an environment like yours, it's just important to understand that this is part of the supply tension, is how much short-term rentals kind of intrude on supply that you would want to make sure is available for year-round residents. So being able to distinguish the owner who's perhaps a seasonal resident who wants to just, get some income from the house when they're not there so they can pay for it, versus a sort of corporate entity coming in and, buying up homes and basically running them as mini hotels. What we noticed when we worked on the report was that some of you had general bylaw provisions, dealing with registration, but had not really yet addressed short-term rentals and zoning. We know that's changing. Again, I'm sort of speaking to a report that was finished a couple of months ago, but I would just say, if you haven't already done this, it's a good idea to keep going and make sure that you've got the right provisions in place to cover registration, the appropriate fees for registration, enforcement, and from a land use perspective, that short-term rentals are happening where you want them to happen, within the frequency you want them to happen, or that you're willing to allow them to happen, and that it's very clear to the community the terms under which short-term rental activity will be allowed. And then there's this concept of fractional ownership. Has not been all that well regulated. It's changing. This is changing everywhere, by the way. Fractional ownership zoning, the whole point is to try to preserve year-round housing by dealing with another type of commercial operation, which is essentially like a timeshare. So Tisbury and Provincetown, as I think you all know, adopted these sort of first versions. The Attorney General's office has approved them. We are aware that some other towns, I think, have recently adopted this. So it's just another tool to have to try to get control over buildings that were intended to be used for dwellings and have been stretched to be something else, which is essentially a commercial activity. So if you haven't already addressed fractional ownership zoning, it's probably something you're going to want to do. So I'm just going to quickly kind of go through the town by town section of the report. Is really just, we have kind of one section for each town. My slides here are just going to catch the summary key recommendations. You're going to want to read through the section that applies to your town, because there's more in it than what I'm going to say. But we tried to kind of bring up to the top things that seemed kind of obvious to us in each town. And you're going to see, I think in almost all these slides, the reference to getting your definitions of affordability consistent and your definition of multifamily as well, so that there is a consistent vocabulary across the island of what these terms actually mean. In Aquinnah's case, we're also suggesting that there really should be some clear regulations for how a multifamily use is provided for and regulated in zoning, and amending your accessory dwelling unit bylaw to align with the provisions of the Affordable Homes Act. Now, there's that. I would say specifically, if your towns don't address ADUs to conform with the AHA, you're going to have to in February anyway, because it's going to go into effect no matter what. But it's a good idea to sort of change your zoning and get it in line with the changes to state law. In Chilmark's case, we said it'd be good to provide clear definitions for affordable community attainable housing, aligning with the definitions that are in other towns, and specifically the Vineyard Commission's vocabulary and their housing needs assessment, revising the ADU bylaw, and then removing the year built restrictions on two-family conversion, and consider providing for multifamily housing by right or by special permit in areas where perhaps you could support some density. I just want to stop here for a second on this. If every town on the Vineyard simply allowed two-family homes in single-family districts, you would have a supply game changer. It's just really obvious to us that there are plenty of situations in your towns where simply allowing a two-family home could take the same lot, no increase in land, just the same lot, and create dwelling units for two households instead of one. So even for people who don't have an appetite for multifamily, thinking about two-family dwellings really matters. So something I think we think all of you should be thinking about.
And this, just to piggyback on that, Judy, I want to say this is something that's come up with a lot of older residents here. We have a tremendous amount of older residents who are overhoused, and there are no downsizing opportunities. So providing for two-family homes actually allows, a 4-bedroom footprint house to be converted into two-bedroom units and actually create downsizing opportunities on footprints that already exist without having to do like large-scale senior housing in other locations.
Completely agree. It's just such an easy tool to begin to start tackling supply without really any change in character at all, other than people having to get over the idea that a single-family home is a single-family home. In Edgartown, again, kind of very similar key points about the definitions of affordability, the ADU bylaw coming up to speed for the Affordable Homes Act, but then also looking at the ways in which you grant approval for affordable one or two family dwellings, and think about perhaps moving over to an as-of-right system, subject to standards that would be in the zoning that you can use to then regulate the activity. Oak Bluffs, again, revising the ADU bylaw to comply with the Affordable Homes Act, amending your requirements for multifamily dwellings and single-family conversion so that it becomes a little easier to do an affordable development or affordable housing development, and then clarify where and how manufactured housing is allowed. Oak Bluffs is one of the towns that does have reference in their zoning to manufactured housing. It's a little bit muddy. It could be cleaned up, and it could be a great tool for creating some affordable homeownership opportunities for people who are just never going to be able to touch even in a deed restricted affordable unit as defined by the state. In Tisbury, aside from dealing with the ADU bylaw, which I know has happened, is to create a separate use for conversion of single family and two family homes to make that easier, recodifying and revising your multifamily dwelling language to make it easier, reducing barriers, and streamline the application process. It also would be worth it to look at the bonuses that are offered for affordable housing to incentivize their use. So really, I think overhauling your multifamily zoning to make it more effective, and again, removing the discretionary approval process would be very, very good for affordable housing in your community. And then in West Tisbury, aside from amending the ADU bylaw, removing barriers to multifamily development, streamlining the approval process for multifamily development so that you can get the best possible outcome from any existing provisions you have to create affordability, and then amending the definition of family so that you remove that limit on four unrelated individuals. So that's really the, summary level version of a long and pretty detailed report. And I am more than happy to take any questions or discuss any of this. But I think to do that, Laura, I'm probably going to take this off stop share because I don't really
That would
need to
be
go-
great. Yeah, if you could
Yeah.
take it off stop share. I think what we'll do first is we have a bunch of questions in the chat.
Yep.
So Judy, if you're okay with it, I'll first go down the questions in the chat for you to answer.
Sure.
And then if anyone has additional questions, you can either raise your electronic hand for me, and that's under, if you see React on your lower bar on your Zoom, you'll see participants, chat, and then React. If you click on React, there's a little raise hand function, and that'll not only raise a little yellow hand, but it'll also move you to the front of the queue so I can see you, because we do have multiple pages of folks on here. Or you can drop an additional question in the chat if you're not able to raise your hand for some reason. So first question we have is from Cindy Trish at Healthy Aging. She's asking, is multifamily housing only for families, or can you have a group of employees living together? Judy, can you talk a little bit about how that works and the intersection between the multifamily bylaw and the employee housing bylaw that you drafted?
And something in between as well.
Exactly.
So, I mean, multifamily is not only for families. You can have, there are certainly lots of examples of a multifamily dwelling, which means a completely independent unit, multiple independent units within a building. You can have those as small or as large as one wishes. Frankly, from a development point of view, it's almost often preferred to do the smaller units because you can do more. And you tend to get a higher rent per foot, but that's another matter. So you can do multifamily housing for seniors. We have lots of examples in Massachusetts of senior housing that's independent living units, and it meets a particular need of people who are not really in need of continuing care or more advanced, nursing or rehab skills. They just want to have a smaller unit to live in. That's one type of multifamily. Then there's this concept of congregate housing, which is really shared living quarters. And that's another model for senior housing, which is really more like it's almost like what assisted living is, except assisted living has services in it. You don't need that for congregate senior housing. You can simply have a system where people have their own bedroom, their own bathroom, perhaps even a small kitchenette sometimes is provided for that. And then shared cooking, dining facilities, shared living room, things of that nature. That's more like what a congregate style is. So you can do both. You can have independent senior living in multifamily buildings. You can have congregate for seniors. It's really a question of, what is the market looking for? What's economic to build? And what levels of affordability are you trying to address as well? Does that help?
Yeah, Cindy, I see you there. Do you want to unmute? Did that answer your question, or do you have follow-up to that?
No, that's helpful. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Judy. So we'll move on to the next question, and that is, what about transient workforce housing? Is that addressed?
Transient workforce. I'm going to
So
put
that
it
would
back
be-
on you to define that for me.
Yeah, Judy, so I think what the questioner is talking about is shorter term employees who are maybe rotating in for 3 weeks or 2 months or something like that, and not year round. And I know that this is actually addressed in the employee housing model bylaw. So can you talk a little bit about how a town can do that?
Yeah, I mean, it's more like sort of a dormitory style arrangement, if you will. It's another form of congregate for uses like a hospital that need housing for people who are cycling in and out. That's just a very important use and a very important type of housing to provide for. So you can, the same kind of building can be created for seasonal workers, for intermittent workers. The point is to have a type of structure that is relatively affordable to create, and it's managed, and it's meeting the needs of employers who don't have just a year-round full-time workforce to accommodate.
And
It's
yeah, and I would invite everyone to take a look at the employee housing bylaw that Judy crafted, because it does speak to the different permutations of this. And I think the point is to just address it in the zoning so that you allow for where it's appropriate, how it can be done, and to actually speak to it in the zoning. But there are multiple ways to do it. And I will say, I know Island Housing Trust has actually done this type of development in the town of Tisbury for the hospital.
Yep.
There's a conversion of a bed and breakfast that's been very successful and really has met the needs of the hospital and hospital employees. It was permitted by the town. And if anyone has questions, you can, check in with Island Housing Trust about how they did that, but it did go through the town process and it was permitted.
So when Nantucket Hospital was going to be rebuilt, they created a special overlay district for the hospital compound. And the hospital was smart enough to write into that overlay district in their zoning bylaw the ability to do employee housing as of right. So they have the ability to do a variety of housing types on their campus, from single family to townhouse to shared quarters for people who are coming in and out. But they covered their needs and they were smart to do it, frankly. We're about to start working on a very similar type of zoning for a hospital in one of the communities in southeastern Massachusetts that has the very same need, because this is sort of becoming more and more common in the healthcare world, is that you have nursing staff coming in for 15 weeks at a time. You have specialized physicians coming periodically, and you have to house them. So having the ability to do that in a congregate, semi-congregate, multifamily, a range of options. I can just tell you from the Nantucket Hospital's experience that the doctors prefer larger quarters that they can bring their families to, whereas the nurses are a little more willing to accept a congregate arrangement. So just think about choice. It's really, what are the needs of that employer and do you provide for them? And you don't need a special permit to do this.
Thanks, Judy. We have a question from IHT, from Island Housing Trust. Can you speak to how the lack of public infrastructure, such as water and sewer, impacts multifamily and housing density in general on Martha's Vineyard?
So we did not go there, but believe me, it was on my mind. And we were looking at from the land use policy perspective. And we're very aware that there are situations, locations on the vineyard where you don't have access to sewer, you don't have access to public sewer, you don't have access to private sewer. What I do not know, because it was not in our scope, was to what extent perhaps local regulations, local health regulations may make it more difficult to do things like shared wastewater systems. Because that's been certainly a solution that's been used in other communities in Massachusetts and beyond, is that, I'm not meeting Title V on a unit by unit basis because I can do a shared system of some type. But yeah, it's a serious constraint, and we're not oblivious to that. What we're saying is, don't let zoning be the barrier, because you got enough other barriers as it is. The zoning doesn't need to do that. It doesn't need to be that gatekeeper for you. If in fact a community can accommodate a higher density than what its zoning says, don't let zoning be the barrier. There's a conversation actively going on about this right now in New Hampshire, where their equivalent to the Department of Environmental Protection has a wonderful technical assistance program on, like, how do you actually gauge based on slope and soils, how much land you need for a septic system. And what they have published in consult with the New Hampshire Housing Agency is most towns up there are requiring much larger lots than they actually need to accommodate wastewater. So there's an effort right now in the legislature in New Hampshire to say, no town is going to be able to require a larger lot than what they need to accommodate wastewater. So I would encourage all of you, while you're thinking about zoning, to also look at your local wastewater regulations. Title V obviously is Title V, but many of the communities I work in have local health regulations that go significantly beyond what Title V says. I don't know if you do, but it's certainly worth looking at.
Thanks, Judy. And then a second question from Island Housing Trust. Can you speak to condominiumization or subdividing of lots to separate ownership of 2 dwelling units on a single lot to create affordable and year-round housing opportunities as with Nantucket zoning? And I think that's referring to Philippe or whoever from IHT asked that question. Am I correct in understanding that that's like referring to the Nantucket Covenant program, which
Probably.
allows subdividing the lot if one of the units is going to be deed restricted to affordable?
So they can subdivide the lot or they can condo the unit. And in any case, it ends up in the covenant program where it becomes a restricted unit. So again, this goes back to, however, you got to look at what what Nantucket zoning says. You can have 2 units on a lot. You've been able to do that in Nantucket for a very long time. And more recently, there was a provision added to allow 3 dwelling units on a lot, long before the Affordable Homes Act came along. So in Nantucket, that provision exists, but if someone doesn't want to retain ownership of both units, recognizing that perhaps someone created a unit on a second unit on their property for guest house or something, they can convey it, but it's going to be subject to an affordable housing restriction and managed through what's called the Nantucket Covenant Program. So it can be done through subdivision, it can be done through condominium. That same program also allows property owners to convey land that will be used for an affordable unit. So the point is, this is a really good example, I think, of where zoning creates the regulatory scheme, but then you still need a programmatic way to receive that benefit so it is protected as an affordable unit.
Thanks, Judy. So if anyone's interested in looking at this, you can go to Housing Nantucket and look at their covenant program. This has been used for a long time. It's created over 100 ownership units, perpetually affordably restricted small ownership units on Nantucket. It's been a very successful program, and it's largely used private funds to create these opportunities.
Right.
They've also paired this with the demolition delay.
Yep.
So on a lot of these lots, they've actually moved structures that would have otherwise been demolished to create housing opportunities on these subdivided lots. It's a very successful program. It's reduced their carbon footprint, created a lot of recycled opportunities, and also reduced costs for folks who qualify for affordable units to help them actually afford to create an opportunity.
Right.
So that's the Covenant Program, Nantucket Housing. The next question, it's actually a comment from Jeff Agnoli saying, I'd like to see Martha's Vineyard follow Nantucket's demolition procedures. Too many relatively newer houses have been demolished for much larger houses, especially in Edgartown. So Jeff, I'd invite you to take a look in the model bylaws at the demolition delay model bylaw, which is, I think, really well written. It's based on Nantucket. And Nantucket actually recently ported over something from, I think, Edgartown. So it's a perfect fit for Edgartown.
Great.
It would allow you to update your bylaw to include Nantuckets. And for the other towns, I think it gives you a really great template to use that would actually solve a lot of the problems that we're seeing in the towns as simply as a result of not having a demolition delay bylaw.
Thank you, Laura.
Sure. Next question is from Michael Kim. Oh, this is an interesting one. Would form-based zoning, also known as form-based code, be too much of a leap to implement as a solution for allowing multifamily use? So Judy, can you first define form-based code for folks and then address it?
So pure form-based code does not regulate land use. It regulates building scale, form, location on a lot. It is a series of dimensional and design controls that essentially focuses on what's going to be built and not how it's used. And in, again, true form-based code, you arrive at the code through an architectural analysis of where your spheres of the greatest density are to where, as density reduces in your community, what's the land use, what's the pattern of building forms as that density changes, so that you're regulating to the form of buildings in your community and trying to arrive at something that people can say, I know what's going to be built. I can anticipate what's going to be built because I can see these building forms that are going to be allowed on a district by district basis. That is a high level way of addressing form-based code. You know, it's a wonderful tool in larger communities. I won't say cities because even some larger towns are trying to use it. But it takes a lot of local capacity to make it work. I think that's the concern I have for small towns, is the capacity it takes to make that kind of zoning work, to be able to interpret and apply that zoning in what is truly an as-of-right permitting process. Takes, I think, a planning department at the very least, with staff who know how to do this, how to interpret that zoning, how to work with applicants. It's not the same as other types of zoning that you're familiar with. So I'm not opposed to form-based code at all. I've just seen it be not as effective in small towns as I think people had hoped. And I think it's largely because of capacity gaps. So it would definitely not be my first recommendation for you folks, especially because I think through more conventional dimensional controls, you can manage multifamily development. You can do these things now as opposed to going through a form-based code analysis.
Great, thanks, Judy. Another question from Island Housing Trust. Are there any multifamily zoning bylaw provisions in any other island town besides Tisbury and West Tisbury?
I'd have to go back and look at the report. I think there may have been in one town, but maybe only through conversion. I think the only, as I recall, and anybody on this call can jump in and correct me, I think those were the only towns where we actually saw specifically provisions for developing multifamily housing. There may have been something in West Tisbury as well.
There's something in Tisbury and West Tisbury, and I'm sorry, I don't have an encyclopedic, like I haven't memorized the report.
Yeah.
I know that Edgartown just adopted something for multi-unit on smaller lots, but I don't have that at my fingertips.
So
it's
actually, I'm sorry.
It's all clearly outlined in the report. So if anyone has questions, like go in the multifamily section, the analysis goes through every town. So you'll see that in the report.
So it is there, but it's a special permit in almost all cases. And the only locations where it's allowed as of right are so small, you can't really even see them on the map that's in the report. We're actually changing that map so that we have a zoom in so you can actually see where these tiny areas are, where multifamily is allowed through some means other than a special permit.
Okay, so I think we are through the questions in the chat. If I missed anything, there were a lot of drop-ins in the chat. So if I missed anything and you have an additional question, please raise your electronic hand. And then is there anybody else who did not ask a question who would like to ask a question of Judy? Let me just scroll through and see. It's very quiet. Oh, Peter Cook from Chilmark. Peter. And can you identify yourself and just say if you're on a board or a committee, like which board or committee you're from, please? And which town?
I'm a highly placed official in the People's Republic of Chilmark on the planning board and the housing committee. And I don't have a question so much as an observation. Judy is providing us with so much well-researched and well-organized information about all of these issues that my ancient brain, the uncommitted cortex is whirling, what's left of it. But one of the things that stood out to me was the notion about special permits and discretionary review. And this is one of those issues. We have a lot to talk about, and that's what
Yeah.
we do best, is talk about these things. But part of the business that we deal with all the time in trying to figure out how the bylaws can be amended or adjusted and how they can be tweaked to try to keep up with what's going on in the world that's moving faster than we ever anticipated. Part of what keeps being evident is that a certain amount of discretion needs to be there for the zoning board of appeals, for the planning board, for the people who are actually going to recommend, if not enforce, whatever regulations come out of whatever adjustments come out. And what that ends up requiring in order to get something done, which is what Judy is suggesting, we might actually get something done on models that have been around for a while, then we're all trying, most of us are trying to catch up, requires a champion. In most cases, it requires a champion.
Right.
And I don't know, I'm speaking for myself, but I think many of the people on this call are volunteers. We as volunteers, in spite of our vast experience and commitment, cannot be held accountable the way people who are paid to produce results can be. And so we are reliant on this sort of input Judy is providing. We have so much to work with. But I guess what I'm saying is I'm grateful for this. We have a lot of work to do, and we have much more to work with. But I think that the challenge that all of this presents to the forms of government we have is so prevalent. It is so obvious. This is what we all have to work on. And enough about me. I'm sorry to run on, but
that was great, Peter. Thank you for that summary. And that actually tees me up to say that this is our next step with this is the housing production plans. This is all part of my evil plan to educate everyone and give you the tools that you need to do the things that you want to do. The first step was the housing needs assessment, which really, mapped out the data. The second step is this incredibly valuable zoning analysis and model bylaw toolkit. The next step is the housing production plans, where Judy is actually going to be the consultant that will help all the towns work through how do we parse all this information and figure out how we can apply it to our housing priorities. So you will have help doing this should you choose to undertake this. And it sounds like all the towns do want to undertake the housing production plans, and we're getting going with this at the end of the month. So we're not just leaving this with you and saying, good luck. Judy's going to be here for the next 6 months to help each of the towns through their own process, work through how to implement, the changes that you feel are most important.
Thank you. Looking forward to it.
Laura, can I just follow up on something Peter said? Because I think it's
Sure.
important about the special permit. So one way to think about it is I have zoning for multifamily housing. I've got my standards that the multifamily housing needs to meet, density, scale, height, whatever. And I think, because I'm allowing this as of right, that a developer is just going to come into my community and say, this is the next best thing since sliced bread. But in fact, sites are all different. And one of the things I can say about working with developers is they want predictability, but they also want flexibility. And that can be very hard to build into a permitting process. A way that I think you might want to think about using the special permit is not to regulate the use, but to create the environment for flexibility. So if a developer needs perhaps an alternative way to create the multifamily housing on a lot that isn't going to quite meet your as of right standards, that they don't have to go get a variance and they don't have to walk away. They can apply for a special permit for some relief. And as long as you built into that zoning the criteria for granting that special permit, you're fine. And that's a way to think about using the special permit, is that it's not a gate that one has to go through just to get to the use, but a way to make it possible on a site-by-site basis to gain some flexibility.
Great. Thanks, Judy, and thanks, Peter. Any more questions? Come on, I know you guys all have tons of questions because I get emails from most of you all the time.
Wanda has her hand up.
I'm sorry, who's that?
Wanda had her hand up.
Wanda, do you have a question?
I do. I wanted to know if Judy would be able to meet with West Tisbury Affordable Housing to discuss just our specific town, since she's done this analysis, to meet with our Affordable Housing Committee. Is that something we could arrange? Since you'll be here for 6 months.
Well, so actually, as soon as West Tisbury designates their point people for the housing production plan, and I know you're in those emails,
I am.
part of the process will be Judy meeting with those point people, and then having those point people help her set up community meetings with not just the committees, but also the residents of West Tisbury to work through these issues. Judy, then maybe this is a good opportunity to just like touch on like the scope of the HPPs and like a little bit about what that process looks like.
So yeah, it's the needs assessment is largely done. The Vineyard Commission has done this amazing island-wide needs assessment. So every housing production plan has to start with that. So a lot of that work is done. I'd say most of it is done. What really I think we have to focus on is working with your communities on identifying barriers. A lot of that's kind of already been done, but then focusing on, or what are the goals for your plan? And those are both numeric and also qualitative, like how much housing are we trying to build and what do we want to get out of this housing? And then strategies to get there. And for a housing production plan to be approved by the state, there are like 5 different types of strategies that have to be in there, from locations that would be appropriate for comprehensive permits, to places where you're going to change your zoning, to what kind of housing do you want. And we're going to kind of map out for all of you right up front. These are the kinds of strategies that have to be in this plan. Help us help you get to the point where you've got a plan that actually can get approved. So there will be, a couple of different community meetings in each town, working on the, what those vision and goals should be, kind of helping everybody understand what an HPP is, and then presenting that draft plan for public comment. So we're going to be around working on all these things with you. We will meet with your individual towns.
All right, I have a second part of that, and it might not be relevant, but I think it is. The Harbor Homes met with us last month on the 17th and showed the dire need for them to have zoning cooperation so that they could find a location to be permanently. They're leaving the community service building in February because they got their funding and they're ready to do their demolition. So is that something that's in your housing production plan? Consideration for the homeless shelters, or is this just for towns?
Well, I think I can speak to that. So that's a need that was identified in the housing needs assessment across all 6 towns.
Right.
So Judy has a supportive housing, transitional housing, congregate housing, shelter housing bylaw in the model bylaw toolkit. And
I heard that, yeah.
So the towns are going to drive this discussion. So if that's a priority for the West Tisbury Affordable Housing Committee, then in the town of West Tisbury, the Affordable Housing Committee would elevate that in conversations and say, this is what we want to be part of the conversation around the housing production plan.
Okay.
And
All
the same in the other towns.
Mm.
Wanda, I'm going to go to just because we're running out of time here, I'm going to go to the next. There was a question from, and thank you so much for those questions. There's a question from Timothy Delaney. Timothy, do you still have that question? And can you unmute? Whoop, Timothy, I'm going to ask you.
There we go.
Oh, great. Perfect.
There used to be a category of housing called single room occupancy, hotels, in New York. Is that a concept that's relevant to us today? Have you touched on it already with your multifamily discussion, or is that yet another form of housing that we should consider as a solution, perhaps for
So
workforce?
such a good question, because SRO housing, so-called, is often permitted through a congregate bylaw, simply because there are shared facilities in an SRO building, shared kitchen, shared laundry, so forth. And the units, SRO units today tend to be a little different from what they were like 25 or 30 years ago. So it's very common to find an individual bathroom. It doesn't
Yeah.
have to be that way, but yeah, I mean, through congregate, that's kind of what I had in mind. And that is an example of housing that often works for a senior population. But it is definitely great for, workers who are very low wage workers who need housing they can afford. SROs are critical.
So it's similar to congregate, it's synonymous with congregate. Do we need to have a separate discussion about SROs, or?
Well,
when you think
I
about
think
congregate,
I think,
we're
Timothy,
there.
if I can, in the model bylaw toolkit, I think if you, as I remember, Judy, and correct me if I'm wrong, if you go into the congregate housing bylaw, it actually, there's a reference to using the congregate housing bylaw for employee housing or for senior housing or for other types of
Yeah, so
housing.
it
That
meets
it's
the
got,
same need.
it's a multi-use application.
Thanks.
My pleasure. Are there any more questions? We're 2 minutes away from 7:30. We can probably take one more question if anyone has one. I am not seeing any hands. So with that, I think I'll say a huge thank you to Judy Barrett. And we have signed the contract. Judy, I haven't
Oh.
scanned it and sent it to you yet, but
Thank you.
we signed the contract for the housing production plans today. So we are going to get that underway this month. So for all towns who haven't yet responded about the housing production plans, there's emails to you. And for any community members who wish to participate, please contact your planning boards and your affordable housing committee and look for the continuing process. And again, you can go to the MVC website to get the zoning analysis itself and also the model bylaw toolkit. And I'll say thank you so much to the amazing Judy Barrett and to Alex and Lucy for running the tech. And good night, everyone.
Good to see you. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.